A sitting world leader is wanted for war crimes. But here's what most people don't know about the ICC's warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu. This isn't just another political headline. It's a legal earthquake that could reshape how we think about accountability at the highest levels of power. The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant that puts Netanyahu in the same category as history's most notorious figures. But can they actually enforce it? The answer might surprise you. The ICC didn't issue this warrant over political disagreements. They claim they have evidence of specific war crimes that shocked even seasoned prosecutors. These aren't accusations thrown around lightly in international courtrooms. The court's investigators spent 18 months gathering evidence before filing charges that place Netanyahu alongside some of history's most wanted figures. International law draws clear lines about what constitutes war crimes. The Geneva Conventions establish specific protections for civilians during armed conflict. The ICC alleges Netanyahu crossed several of these lines during military operations in Gaza. The charges center on two main violations that carry the heaviest penalties under international criminal law. The first charge involves deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure. The court claims Israeli forces systematically destroyed hospitals, schools, and residential buildings under Netanyahu's command authority. The second charge accuses him of using starvation as a weapon of war by restricting humanitarian aid to Gaza's population. These aren't minor violations. They're the same categories used against dictators and warlords who face life imprisonment. The ICC prosecutors spent months building their case through methodical evidence collection. They gathered witness testimonies from survivors who described systematic targeting of hospitals and schools. Medical personnel provided detailed accounts of attacks on healthcare facilities while treating patients. Teachers and aid workers documented strikes on educational buildings during active school hours. The evidence includes intercepted communications between Israeli military commanders discussing specific targets. The court obtained recordings of planning sessions where officials allegedly discussed civilian infrastructure as legitimate military objectives. Satellite imagery shows the destruction of civilian areas in coordinated patterns. The court claims this proves intentional targeting rather than collateral damage from military operations. Legal experts point out that proving intent is the hardest part of any war crimes case. Prosecutors must demonstrate that commanders knew their actions would harm civilians and proceeded anyway. The ICC believes they have smoking gun evidence that shows deliberate decision-making at the highest levels of Israeli government. Former international prosecutors say this type of evidence is rare in war crimes cases. The timing matters in building the prosecution's case. These alleged crimes occurred during a period when international observers repeatedly warned about civilian casualties. The United Nations issued multiple statements expressing concern about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Aid organizations documented the systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure while these warnings were being issued. Military analysts note that modern warfare technology allows for precise targeting. GPS-guided munitions can strike within meters of intended targets. This precision makes claims of accidental civilian casualties harder to defend in court. The ICC argues that the level of destruction in civilian areas could only result from deliberate targeting decisions. The court's investigation uncovered internal Israeli military documents discussing operational procedures. These documents allegedly show knowledge of likely civilian harm from specific military actions. Some communications reportedly include discussions about acceptable levels of civilian casualties for achieving military objectives. This type of documentation forms the backbone of the prosecution's intent argument. Witness statements from military personnel add another layer to the evidence. Some Israeli soldiers provided testimony describing orders they believed violated international law. These witnesses claim they raised concerns about targeting decisions with their commanders. Their statements describe a command structure that prioritized military objectives over civilian protection. The ICC also collected medical records from Gaza hospitals showing patterns of injuries. Forensic experts analyzed these records to determine weapon types used in attacks. The patterns allegedly show deliberate targeting of medical facilities rather than random damage from nearby military operations. Hospital administrators provided testimony about receiving advance warnings before attacks on their facilities. Satellite imagery analysis forms a crucial part of the evidence package. Independent analysts tracked the destruction of civilian infrastructure over time. The imagery reportedly shows systematic targeting of essential services like water treatment plants and power stations. This pattern of destruction suggests coordinated military planning rather than random damage. But having evidence and being able to act on it are two completely different things in international law. The ICC faces significant challenges in enforcing any warrant against a sitting world leader. The court's authority depends entirely on cooperation from member countries. The ICC's evidence file reportedly contains over 3,000 pages of documentation. This makes it one of their most comprehensive cases ever filed against a current head of government. The sheer volume of evidence suggests months of preparation by experienced war crimes prosecutors. This level of detail indicates the court spent significant time preparing for the political firestorm they knew would follow such unprecedented charges. Here's the weird part about international arrest warrants. They work completely differently when the target runs their own military and controls their own borders. Netanyahu sits in the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem, protected by the Israeli Defense Forces and domestic intelligence services. No foreign police force can simply walk into Israel and make an arrest. The mechanics of international law enforcement become almost absurd when the suspect commands the very forces that would need to be overpowered to execute the warrant. Normal arrest warrants get executed by local police who have jurisdiction in their territory. A judge issues the warrant, police officers receive their orders, and they show up at the suspect's door with legal authority to make an arrest. International warrants rely on something much more complicated: the cooperation of other countries. The ICC has no police force of its own. They can't send agents across borders to apprehend suspects. Every arrest depends on the willingness of sovereign nations to enforce international law within their own territory. Netanyahu can't be arrested in Israel because Israel doesn't recognize the ICC's authority. Israel never joined the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court. Israeli law enforcement has no obligation to execute ICC warrants. But the moment he steps foot in any of the 123 countries that do recognize the court, he becomes fair game. This creates a geographic trap that transforms international travel into a potential arrest scenario. The legal mechanism is called universal jurisdiction. It means certain crimes are so serious that any country can prosecute them, regardless of where they happened. War crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide fall into this category. The principle recognizes that some acts are so heinous, they offend the entire international community. Countries that signed the Rome Statute agreed to arrest suspects wanted by the ICC when those suspects enter their territory. Countries like Germany and France have already indicated they would be legally obligated to arrest Netanyahu if he visits. German officials stated they would enforce the warrant according to their domestic laws implementing the Rome Statute. French authorities made similar statements about their legal obligations under international treaties. This isn't a political choice, it's a legal requirement under their own laws. These countries bound themselves to ICC cooperation when they ratified the Rome Statute decades ago. The warrant creates a practical prison without physical walls. Netanyahu's travel options just shrunk dramatically from 195 potential destinations to roughly 70 countries. He can only visit countries that either don't recognize the ICC or are willing to ignore their legal obligations. The United States, Russia, and China never joined the ICC, making them safe destinations. But most of Europe, Canada, Australia, and large portions of Africa and South America now represent arrest risks. Previous cases show how this geographical limitation plays out in practice. Omar al-Bashir, Sudan's former president, spent years dodging arrest warrants by carefully choosing which countries to visit. Al-Bashir traveled to Chad, Egypt, and South Africa, all ICC member countries that chose not to arrest him despite their legal obligations. His movements became a constant calculation of political relationships versus legal requirements. Some countries faced criticism from the international community for failing to execute the warrants. The travel restrictions force leaders to become experts in international law and diplomatic relationships. Al-Bashir's security team maintained detailed lists of safe and dangerous countries for travel. They monitored political developments that might change a country's willingness to enforce ICC warrants. Intelligence services tracked which airports might pose arrest risks during flight connections. But Netanyahu's situation is more complex because Israel is a major ally to many ICC member countries. Germany receives significant intelligence cooperation from Israel on counter-terrorism operations. France maintains extensive military and technological partnerships with Israeli defense companies. These relationships create political pressure to ignore legal obligations under the Rome Statute. Diplomatic considerations often override legal requirements in international relations. The enforcement challenge extends beyond simple arrests to diplomatic immunity questions. Netanyahu travels on diplomatic passports that typically provide protection from arrest during official state visits. However, war crimes charges create exceptions to diplomatic immunity under international law. The legal precedent remains unclear about whether diplomatic status protects against ICC warrants. Legal experts say this creates the most significant travel restrictions ever imposed on a sitting leader of a democratic nation. Previous ICC warrants targeted dictators from countries with limited international relationships. Netanyahu leads a democracy with extensive diplomatic ties and economic partnerships worldwide. The warrant essentially turns Netanyahu into an international fugitive the moment he leaves Israeli territory. His freedom of movement now depends entirely on the political calculations of foreign governments. The ICC doesn't issue warrants based on news reports or political pressure. They claim to have a paper trail that directly links Netanyahu to specific military decisions. Prosecutors spent 2 years assembling evidence through intelligence sources, military defectors, and forensic analysis. The court's investigators operated like detectives building a murder case. They needed proof that connected the Prime Minister's office to battlefield actions that killed civilians. War crimes prosecutions require proving that leaders knew about illegal actions and either ordered them or failed to stop them. The ICC says they have both. Command responsibility doctrine holds military and political leaders accountable for crimes committed by their subordinates. Prosecutors must show the leader knew or should have known about the illegal acts. They also must prove the leader had effective control over the forces committing crimes. Leaked documents suggest the court obtained internal Israeli military communications discussing civilian targets. If authentic, these communications could prove intent to harm non-combatants. The alleged intercepts include discussions between Netanyahu's security cabinet and military commanders about targeting policies in Gaza. Sources familiar with the evidence describe conversations where officials weighed civilian casualties against military objectives. These intercepts allegedly show decision-makers aware their actions would harm protected populations. The evidence reportedly includes recorded conversations between military commanders discussing operations that resulted in civilian casualties. These recordings allegedly show knowledge of likely civilian harm before strikes occurred. Military intelligence officers described briefings where casualty estimates included civilian deaths from proposed operations. The recordings capture commanders acknowledging hospitals and schools as legitimate targets under revised rules of engagement. Field commanders allegedly expressed concerns about targeting decisions during operational planning sessions. Electronic surveillance captured communications between Netanyahu's office and military headquarters during critical decision points. Digital forensics experts analyzed metadata from government communication systems to establish timelines. The evidence allegedly shows Netanyahu personally authorizing military operations after receiving casualty projections that included civilian deaths. Technical analysis of encrypted communications revealed discussions about acceptable civilian casualty ratios for achieving military objectives. Witness statements from military personnel describe receiving orders that they believed violated international law. Some witnesses claim they raised concerns about targeting decisions with their superiors. Israeli intelligence officers provided testimony about orders to target civilian infrastructure like power plants and water facilities. Artillery commanders described receiving target lists that included hospitals and schools without military justification. These witnesses submitted sworn statements through intermediaries to protect their identities from retaliation. Military chaplains reportedly provided accounts of soldiers expressing moral concerns about their missions. Medical Corps personnel described treating civilian casualties from operations they believed violated rules of engagement. Intelligence analysts testified about pressure to classify civilian targets as military objectives in official reports. Some officers claimed they documented their objections to illegal orders in official military correspondence. The ICC also collected medical records from Gaza hospitals, showing patterns of injuries consistent with deliberate targeting of medical facilities. Forensic pathologists analyzed wound patterns to determine weapon types used in hospital attacks. The medical evidence allegedly shows systematic targeting of operating rooms and emergency departments during active treatment periods. Hospital administrators provided patient records showing casualties from medical staff killed during their duties. Ballistics experts examined shrapnel patterns from hospital bombings to determine strike locations and weapon systems used. The forensic analysis allegedly shows precision-guided munitions struck specific hospital departments rather than random damage from nearby military targets. Medical equipment destruction patterns suggest deliberate targeting of life support systems and surgical facilities. Emergency room surveillance footage allegedly captured the moments of impact during active medical procedures. Satellite imagery analysis reportedly shows the systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure in patterns that suggest coordinated military planning rather than random damage. Geospatial intelligence analysts tracked the progression of infrastructure destruction over time. The imagery allegedly reveals coordinated strikes on power grids, water treatment plants, and communication networks within specific timeframes. Pattern analysis shows infrastructure destruction following predetermined sequences rather than opportunistic targeting. But Israel's government claims this evidence was obtained illegally and taken out of context. Israeli officials argue that intelligence intercepts violate sovereign immunity and represent espionage against a democratic ally. Government lawyers claim recorded conversations were edited to remove military justifications for targeting decisions. They argue witness statements come from disgruntled personnel with personal grievances against military leadership. Legal analysts say the ICC's evidence collection methods will likely face intense scrutiny, but the volume of documentation suggests a carefully built case. The court's prosecutors have experience from previous war crimes cases and know their evidence needs to withstand challenges from world-class defense attorneys. International criminal law requires evidence standards that exceed domestic criminal prosecutions. Israel never joined the ICC, which should protect Netanyahu from prosecution. But international law has a backdoor that the court is now using against him. Israel made a deliberate decision in 1998 to avoid signing the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court. Israeli officials feared the court might target their military operations in occupied territories. They watched as other countries debated membership while keeping their distance from any international body that could prosecute Israeli leaders. The ICC can only prosecute citizens of member countries or crimes committed on member territory. Israel belongs to neither category, which should make Netanyahu untouchable. The Rome Statute clearly limits the court's jurisdiction to specific circumstances. Either the accused person must be a national of a member state, or the crimes must occur on the territory of a member state. Israel carefully avoided both scenarios by never joining the court and maintaining that territories like Gaza don't belong to any ICC member state. Palestine's membership in the ICC changes everything. The court claims jurisdiction because the alleged crimes occurred in Palestinian territory, which Palestine referred to the ICC for investigation. Palestine became an ICC member in 2015 after gaining observer state status at the United Nations. Palestinian officials immediately referred the situation in their territories to the ICC prosecutor for investigation. This referral opened the door for prosecuting anyone who committed crimes on Palestinian soil, regardless of their nationality. This creates a legal paradox that goes beyond simple jurisdictional questions. Israel doesn't recognize Palestine as a state, but the ICC does. The court is essentially using Palestine's membership to prosecute Israeli officials for actions Israel claims occurred on Israeli territory. Israeli legal experts argue this represents a fundamental overreach by an international court. They claim the ICC is making political determinations about statehood that exceed its criminal justice mandate. The Palestinian Authority gained ICC membership through a complex process that bypassed traditional diplomatic recognition. They applied directly to the ICC prosecutor rather than waiting for full United Nations membership. The court's registrar accepted Palestine's membership application based on their UN observer status. This procedural pathway allowed Palestine to access ICC jurisdiction without resolving broader questions about Palestinian statehood under international law. Israel's legal team argues the ICC has no jurisdiction because Palestine isn't a real state under international law. The court disagrees and says Palestine meets the legal requirements for statehood. Israeli attorneys point to the lack of effective government control over Gaza and parts of the West Bank. They argue Palestine cannot delegate jurisdiction it doesn't actually possess. ICC judges ruled that Palestine exercises sufficient governmental authority to qualify as a state for court purposes. The jurisdictional dispute goes to the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict itself. The ICC's decision to proceed effectively recognizes Palestinian territorial claims that Israel disputes. Israeli settlements in the West Bank become potential crime scenes under ICC jurisdiction if Palestine controls that territory. Gaza's status becomes crucial for determining whether crimes occurred on Palestinian soil or in disputed areas without clear sovereignty. Legal scholars are divided on whether the court has legitimate authority in this case. Some constitutional law experts say the ICC is overstepping its mandate by making political determinations about statehood. They argue criminal courts should not resolve territorial disputes between competing governments. Other international law professors counter that this is exactly what international justice requires. They claim war crimes prosecutions cannot wait for political resolution of territorial disputes. The debate extends to academic conferences and legal journals worldwide. Harvard Law School professors published competing analyses of the ICC's jurisdictional decision. Some argue the court exceeded its authority by accepting Palestine's membership without full statehood recognition. Others maintain that the Rome Statute's language supports the court's interpretation of territorial jurisdiction. The jurisdictional question could ultimately determine whether the entire case survives legal challenges. Netanyahu's defense team will likely challenge ICC authority before addressing the underlying war crimes charges. They will argue the court lacks fundamental jurisdiction to prosecute Israeli officials. This jurisdictional challenge could delay proceedings for years, while appellate chambers review the basic authority question. The ICC's pretrial chamber already ruled they have jurisdiction, but this decision could be appealed all the way to the International Court of Justice. The appeals process allows for multiple levels of review on jurisdictional questions. Each appeal suspends proceedings on the underlying charges, while courts examine their own authority. The International Court of Justice could provide final interpretation of the Rome Statute's jurisdictional provisions. This jurisdictional maze means the legal battle over the warrant might last years, even if Netanyahu is never arrested. The precedent established will affect future ICC cases involving disputed territories worldwide. The ICC warrant against Netanyahu represents uncharted territory in international law. A democratic leader from a non-member country faces war crimes charges through a jurisdictional backdoor that most legal experts never expected to see used. The court exploited Palestine's membership to prosecute Israeli officials for actions on disputed territory. Whether the court can actually enforce this warrant depends less on legal authority and more on political will from member countries. Nations must choose between international law and diplomatic relationships with Israel. France and Germany indicated they would make arrests, but enforcement remains uncertain. This case will likely define the future of international criminal justice and whether world leaders can truly be held accountable for their actions. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. See you next time.